when you start sewing your completed foundation paper piece units together, you'll see in the instructions it tells you to remove the paper from the seam allowances a lot. Pretty much every time you sew two units together, the next step will be to remove this paper. Now the reason I like to remove the paper is twofold. For one reason, if you leave the paper in the seam allowance, pressing this so that it's flat is really hard. The other thing is if you just continue to put pieces together, leaving the paper in the seam allowance, it's going to be nearly impossible to remove it as you move farther along in the piecing. And what I found is even though the seam allowance paper is gone, the rest of the paper stays put. There's enough of it left underneath the thread in the seam so that it's not a problem. So, to remove the paper, often there will be stitches that have been sewn through the seam allowance. When I'm trying to remove this paper, what I try to do is loosen those stitches without tearing the paper. Now, sometimes you can do that and sometimes you can't. If you can't, you'll probably have to use tweezers, and I like these appliqué ergonomic tweezers for this job. But if you can, it'll crease like this if you always crease on the seam and then tear the vellum just like that and pull this side and then turn it over on the other side. Now let me show you what happens here. This is another seam that's been sewn through the seam allowance paper. This time, instead of trying to pop those stitches open, I'll just tear that and see how it doesn't do as well. It left me a bit of paper there. I'm going to ignore it for a minute. I crease this and remove the paper, and then I'm going to crease this down, and see, that pulled over all by itself, so I didn't have to worry about it. Now right here, this paper has not been sewn through, but it's creased, and I'm going to go ahead and tear it along that creased edge, just like that. I took a little more than I intended to, but that's not the end of the world. It'll be just fine. Now, let me pull in a little bit so you can see. These little bits of paper, I don't ignore them at this point. I go ahead and take them off because it's easier to do that now than it will be later when I've sewn more to it. That'll come out by itself. Sometimes I mess with these, just like that. Now, something I have found with tweezers is if you squeeze them too hard, they don't always work as well as if you don't squeeze them super hard. I think that's because if you squeeze them really hard here, it might open up the grip at the end a little bit, although not so much with these. The other thing is I don't want to wear my fingers out with the tweezers. Just like that. So I would clean this up, both sides, and then take it to the ironing board and press it. Now you'll notice there are arrows that tells you what direction to press the seam allowance. And I would press this right side up, not wrong side up. The reason is because it'll fold over better if you do it right side up. The other thing is that if you run a hot iron over the ink side of the paper, it can get on your the sole plate of your iron. It can sometimes smear. It's just better to iron this side of the paper as little as you can get away with ironing it. So I would take this to the ironing board, I would press it, and then I would move on to the next step. So that's how you remove the papers from the seam allowances, and it's a step you don't want to skip. Enjoy your sewing.